The winter of 1938 came heavy to the Korean countryside. Gyeonggi Province, a stretch of farmland not far from the capital, lay under a low ceiling of cloud, its fields crusted with frost. The wind moved sluggishly across the paddies, rattling the bare branches but carrying no birdsong. In the villages, shutters were pulled tight against the cold, and smoke from wood stoves rose in thin columns, only to flatten and disappear against the grey sky. Life was hard that year, but steady. Families huddled together, sharing rice, stories, and silence. At the edge of one such village, beyond the last dirt road and into the sloping farmland, stood the Lee farmhouse. Modest in size, its timbers were dark with age, the tiled roof patched with straw, and the courtyard lined with neat jars of rice and soy. To anyone passing by, it looked ordinary, almost stubbornly so, a portrait of rural life unbothered by change. The Lees were known as quiet people, farmers who rarely raised their voices and never asked much from their neighbors. Father, mother, 6 children, a household that blended into the fabric of the land like the worn stones of the well. But in December, something shifted. Villagers began to notice an unease about the property, though they could not say exactly what it was. The dogs that normally dozed near the gate no longer lay there. Lanterns burned later than usual, glowing faintly against the curtain of fog. Some claimed to hear voices carried on the wind, low, rhythmic tones that were not quite song, not quite prayer. When asked, the Lees only smiled politely and said nothing. Then, one night, silence fell heavier than ever before. The farmhouse windows glowed faintly with lamplight, but no movement stirred inside. No footsteps crunched the frozen ground. No sound of laughter or quarrel escaped the paper walls. The villagers who passed on their way home from the gathering that evening remarked how still it seemed, as if the house itself had fallen asleep. One even said the air around it felt different, thick, as though the fog clung tighter to the ground there. By morning, the silence remained. Smoke failed to rise from the chimney. The usual clatter of pots, the shouts of children, the creak of the wooden gate, all were absent. Instead, only the faint scrape of branches in the cold wind answered the neighbors' ears. A chicken wandered loose in the yard, pecking at the dirt. The jars of rice sat undisturbed, lids sealed against the frost. And yet the house, though quiet, gave off an unsettling impression, not of abandonment but of interruption, as if life had been paused mid-breath. When a neighbor finally knocked, the sound echoed strangely against the wood, swallowed rather than returned. No answer came. The door, when slid open, revealed the dim glow of an oil lamp still burning inside. On the table, bowls of rice rested untouched, steam no longer rising but the meal still fresh. Quilts were spread neatly on the floor, the indentations of small bodies pressed into them like shadows of the night before. Everything remained exactly where it should have been, except the family. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole, leaving behind a stage set for lives that would never return. And standing in that doorway, the neighbor whispered the only question that seemed to fit the moment. Where had the Lees gone? Morning came late that winter, as if the sun itself were reluctant to look upon the fields. Frost held on to the reed roofs and clung in white lace to the fence lines. In the lane beside the Lee farmhouse, a cartwheel rutted the earth and then stilled. The miller's boy paused, listening for the usual noises at that hour. No ladle met a pot. No broom scuffed the courtyard bricks. No sleepy call from a mother urging children to wash their faces before the water turned to ice. There was only the steady breath of the wind moving through the empty paddies and the soft cluck of a single hen scratching where it should not have been. The gate stood not quite closed. That was the first small thing. Father Lee kept his gate bars aligned so neatly that neighbors joked he could set a watch by them. Today, the crossbar drooped, as if a tired hand had left it. The second small thing sat beside the well, The water pail waited full, the rope stiff with cold, the wooden ladle balanced on the rim as though set down while someone turned to answer a call and never returned. The third small thing drifted from the chimney. There was no smoke. In winter, there was always a little smoke, even before dawn, even on the meanest days. The ash in the fire pan inside would later tell why. It had been tended last night and left to die. Old Widow Han came with her bundle of kindling, glanced at the gate, and stopped. She saw the pail, saw the quiet chimney, and let the wood slide to the ground. She called the mother's name once, twice. The sound did not carry. The cold swallowed it whole. She put a hand to the gate and pushed. The bar lifted with a soft complaint. Somewhere in the yard, a chicken startled, wings scraping the stacked jars. The rest remained still. Widow Han pressed her palm to the door frame. It felt colder than the air. She knocked. A thin knock that struck wood and disappeared. The door slid back under her fingers with less resistance than it should have had. The room met her in a low, amber glow. An oil lamp guttered on the table, wick burnt down to a tiny eye that refused to close. Bowls waited, 2 large ones, several small, each with a neat mound of rice that had cooled to a flat white sheen. Chopsticks rested across the rims, no grains stuck to their tips. A kettle sat beside the brazier, its handle tilted like the ear of a patient animal. When Han touched it, the metal held a ghost of warmth that might have been memory rather than heat. She whispered again and again, no answer came. The floor quilts were laid in 2 tidy rows, each blanket smoothed in a manner that mothers use when they tuck children in and set the night to rights. In the cotton there were shallow hollows where bodies had been. They were not collapsed as if someone had thrashed in sleep. They were faint, like pressed breath. Beside the quilt, small shoes had been set in pairs, cloth shoes, straw sandals, all waiting. The family's clothes hung in their customary places, father's coat, mother's padded jacket, tiny sleeves pinned with wooden pegs to keep their shape. On the low chest near the far wall sat a little lacquered comb and a few hairpins. A thin coin waited on the lid where a child had been told to leave it for morning temple offerings. The coin remained. Han stepped backward, steadied herself on the door frame, and felt something gritty under her palm. She looked up. On the lintel, faint and chalk pale, a spiral curled in a cautious hand. Another spiral lay at the baseboard near the threshold, drawn so lightly it disappeared unless the light struck at an angle. She crouched and saw that the spirals did not stand alone. A line of them ran along the beam, small to large, like the growth rings of a tree unknotting itself across the wood. They were not the smears of children. Each curve had been set with care. By then, the miller's boy had fetched the headman. He arrived with 2 neighbors and stood with his hands tucked into his sleeves, eyes moving in a slow inventory. He took in the lamp, the bowls, the quilts, the chalk. He walked the courtyard in measured steps, peering at the ground where frost held every print like a pressed fern. There were many tracks, some old, some crisp, a confusion of feet. Yet in the hard earth just beyond the ash bin he found a circle that the frost had refused. A narrow band where the ground had burned to a darker color and cooled. In the half-dawn light it showed as a seam of ash laid carefully, not thrown. He squatted and pinched a bit to his tongue, the way men of the field sometimes taste earth to know its mood. It bit bitter and resinous, as if herbs had smoldered there. They called for the colonial constables because that was what one did. 2 men arrived from the road, uniforms buttoned up to their throats, faces flat with the habit of telling villagers to be sensible. They removed their shoes at the threshold with stiff care and stepped inside as if into a stage set for a play they did not like. They touched nothing at first. They only looked and wrote. The officer with the notebook peered at the lamp and at the small pool of oil that had crept under its base. He sniffed the air near the brazier and wrote again. He lifted the lid on the rice jar and let it fall with a gentle thud. full. He slid open the chest and paused at the sight of folded bedding and a pair of child's winter mitts stitched with red thread. He closed the chest. One constable crouched at the threshold and rubbed the chalk between his fingers. He frowned at the spirals. He stood and traced their path along the lintel with a pencil he would not allow to touch the wood. In the main room he found more marks, so thin and pale that they seemed to hover rather than sit. Circles nested within circles near the legs of the table. A narrow line drawn from hearth to door, no wider than a reed stem. On the far wall, high where a child could not have reached, someone had pressed 3 small handprints in ash and then wiped them away until only the ghosts of palms remained. They inspected the window paper. In one panel, the paper had been pierced from within, not torn, only pricked in tiny holes that formed a pattern a man might recognize if he stared long enough. It suggested the shape of hills repeating and a narrow path threading them. The constable held his notebook beside the light and studied the pattern until his eyes watered. He set the notebook down and rubbed his lids with his thumb and forefinger as if they burned. In the courtyard, the headman and a neighbor lifted the lid of the biggest earthen jar and found nothing unusual. Soy paste thick and dark, brine still clear. They peered beneath the raised floor for any sign of disturbance and found only the familiar detritus of a working house, a fallen button, a broken chopstick, a bead that might have rolled away from a string and never been found. At the gate, the dog's rope lay coiled on the post. The dog itself did not appear. The officers spoke quietly with the headman. They asked about debts, quarrels, visitors. The headman gave careful answers. The Lees were steady people. They kept their accounts. They nodded to everyone at the market and shared seed in lean years and borrowed tools in the way neighbors do. He mentioned that lanterns had been seen late at night, that voices had been heard, but he lowered his eyes when he said it, as if placing rumor on a table between lawmen required apology. The officers made a mark in the notebook and said, "Little." They returned inside and stood at the table a long moment. A grain of rice had fallen on the floor and lodged in the crack between boards. One officer bent and coaxed it free with the nail of his smallest finger. He held it up, a single white oval in a room that waited, and then he let it fall back to the wood. The sound it made was a click far too loud for so small a thing. In that click, everything that was wrong in the house announced itself again. Food prepared and not eaten, beds laid and not warmed, shoes paired and not worn, a room that had not been emptied but abandoned by breath. Before they left, a gust of air moved through the house and stirred the lamp flame. The wick flared and went out. In the brief smoke twist that rose, the faintest scent came and vanished. It was not only oil. It was something bitter and green, something gathered from hillsides and dried on string. Mugwort, perhaps, or pine, the kind of thing a grandmother burns when the old ways ask to be honored. The chalk spirals caught what light remained and seemed to turn without moving. Outside, the ash ring held its shape, unwilling to be scattered by ordinary wind. The search would spread from that quiet beginning, from a room set carefully for a meal that no one finished. Neighbors would open sheds, probe ditches, call names into the hard light. The constables would return with more paper, more questions, the slow machinery of official concern. Yet the first truth of the house would refuse to change. Nothing was broken, nothing was taken, nothing had struggled. The Lees had simply stepped out of their lives as if the door led somewhere other than the yard, and the house, with its chalk and its ash and its careful order, remained to hold the shape of their absence. The days after the farmhouse was first entered were marked not by clarity but by layers of unease. At first, the constables treated it as a disappearance like any other. Families sometimes fled debt, sometimes ran from quarrels with landlords or colonial officers. Yet, as the neighbors lingered, As each villager repeated what they had seen and heard, fragments began to emerge. And with each fragment came the sense that the Lee household had been preparing for something, though no one could say what. The first piece came from a chest beneath the sleeping quilts. A young officer, searching for clothing or money hidden away, pulled out a narrow notebook bound in cheap paper. The cover bore no title, only a faint smear of ash across the corner. Inside, the writing shifted between careful brush strokes and hurried scrawls, as if written by two different hands. The first pages spoke of planting schedules, debts owed, grain accounted for. But as the months of entries crept closer to that winter, the language changed. One note read, "Voices in the courtyard at night. They tell us the frost will not lift until the offering is set." Another, "Children whisper to one another in dreams. They speak words they could not have learned here." The officers underlined these lines and closed the book. There were drawings too, tucked inside the back cover. Child's drawings, done in rough charcoal, smudged by small fingers. They showed the farmhouse as seen from the fields, but in the sky above hung circles layered on circles, each ringed with lines like rays or chains. In one drawing, stick figures stood inside the circles, their hands raised. One of the constables muttered that children often drew nonsense, but he folded the papers with a care that betrayed his doubt. The second piece of evidence came from the neighbors. A boy of 11 who had often played with the Lee children admitted he had seen them acting strangely in the weeks before. They would not play near the stream, though it had been their favorite place in summer. They would not cross the courtyard without whispering something under their breath, a chant in a language the boy did not know. Once, he said, he saw the youngest daughter stand barefoot on the frozen ground, hands clasped, murmuring at the gate. When he asked what she was doing, she only replied, "Not me, not me." He had not told his parents until now, and when he did, his mother slapped his cheek and told him never to repeat it. But the words lingered. The third came from a bundle of letters hidden beneath the rice jar lids. They were written on torn scraps, folded so tightly they had almost become one with the grain dust. Some were addressed to no one, simply prayers scrawled in haste. "We obey, we keep the fields, do not take us all." Others were more formal, as if meant for a figure of authority. One letter begged for release. "If the debt must be paid, take the eldest, leave the youngest. We have served long, spare us once." The handwriting trembled, and the final line ended not in a period but in a smear where the brush had broken. Neighbors who came to whisper outside the farmhouse began telling older stories. They recalled that the Lees had been distant, but never cruel. Yet, in the autumn markets, when famine threatened, the mother had been seen trading not just grain but small bundles of herbs tied with red string. Some called them remedies, others called them charms. And a few recalled seeing her bow low to an old man at the edge of the village, a figure no one else claimed to know, as if she recognized a priest others had long forgotten. The officers dismissed such talk at first, but when they returned to the farmhouse after dusk, the atmosphere pressed upon them. The chalk spirals glowed faintly in the lamplight, more vivid than by day. The ash prints on the wall seemed sharper. They began to consider that the evidence, the diary, the drawings, the letters, was not only strange but coherent. A pattern was forming. A household convinced that it had been chosen. A family that knew something was coming and had written it down in fragments, as if warning themselves in the only way they could. What unsettled the investigators most was not the superstition itself, but how it had been embraced by every member of the house. The children's drawings matched the diary entries. The letters echoed the whispers heard in the courtyard. It was not one person losing reason. It was a family living in preparation for a moment they believed inevitable. And still, the central question hardened. Chosen for what? The diary closed with a single unfinished line, ink frozen mid-word. The last page bore no date, only the faint outline of a circle, drawn over and over until the paper tore. The officers set it down in silence. Around them, the farmhouse waited like a mouth sealed tight. The official story would still call it banditry or flight from debts, but in the village, no one believed it. In the village, the whispers carried something darker. The Lees had not vanished by chance. They had stepped into a ritual written long before their birth, a ritual that now reached for others. The search that began with the Lee farmhouse did not end at its walls. The constables widened their circle, moving through frozen lanes and asking questions with a rehearsed severity. But the farther they pressed into the village, the more resistance they met. At first, it was silence, polite bows, muttered answers, doors closed with apologetic hands. Then came evasion. Farmers claimed not to have seen the Lees for weeks, though they had eaten beside them at the market feast days earlier. Shopkeepers insisted no letters had passed through their hands, even as torn envelopes lay in their refuse. Every word was sanded smooth, as if the community had been drilled in denial. The headman himself grew sharp. He urged the officers to leave the matter to him, to let villagers settle what they called house business. But, when pressed, he revealed nothing more than a tight smile. In his eyes was something colder than fear, endurance, the look of a man long accustomed to holding secrets. The investigators turned instead to those at the margins. An old reverend at the crumbling chapel admitted in whispers that the Lees had not been to service in months. He had visited them once, carrying rice as offering, only to be turned away at the gate. The mother had bowed low but would not meet his eyes. Behind her, he had glimpsed figures moving in the lamplight, their heads covered, chanting softly. When he asked who they were, she simply said, "Helpers of the field," and shut the door. The Reverend confessed he had prayed harder since that night, for he recognized the chant not as prayer but as fragments of older shamanic hymns, the kind banned by colonial rule but never fully erased. The schoolteacher offered another shard of truth. He recalled how the Lee children had stopped reciting their lessons properly. Instead of repeating multiplication tables, they would murmur words that meant nothing in Korean or Japanese. One child, when pressed, wrote the syllables on the slate. The letters curved in ways that did not match any known script. The teacher wiped the board quickly, but the sound of that chalk scratching in his classroom had stayed in his mind. When he described it to investigators, his hand trembled so much he dropped his pipe. The constable who recorded this testimony grew increasingly aware that each respected figure, reverend, teacher, council elder, knew more than they dared to say. Their words aligned too neatly, as if they had rehearsed caution. It was not simply fear of superstition, nor mere dread of authority. It was complicity. When an elderly midwife was brought forward, she refused to speak at first. Only when pressed late at night, away from the headman's gaze, did she admit to what she had seen. Years earlier, she claimed she had been called to the Lee home during a difficult birth. When the child was delivered safely, she had noticed symbols carved beneath the bed frame. Spirals, triangles, and marks like chains. She had been told not to mention them. Later, she was given rice and cloth as payment, far too much for her service. She had taken it, but she never returned. Her words were half confession, half curse. They were bound to it, as we all are. The picture darkened further with a cache of older documents found in the council archive. Faded minutes of meetings spoke of agreements and provisions during the famine years. The phrasing was bureaucratic, but between the lines pulsed something grim. One note read, "To ensure the next harvest, families will rotate the debt." Another, "The chosen must be honored, silence ensures survival." Though the words never admitted sacrifice outright, the implication was clear enough for the officers. The Lee family had not been victims of chance. They had been part of a system designed to shield the rest. This secrecy stretched back decades. Testimonies whispered of torchlit gatherings in the hills, of old chants rising above the paddies when crops failed. Some villagers admitted that these rites had always been justified as protection, not cruelty. Blood fed the soil, they said, and the soil fed the people. It was not murder, but tradition. And in those thin explanations, the outlines of a conspiracy sharpened. The Lees, by bloodline or by debt, had been chosen, and the village, from its teachers to its midwives to its councilmen, had all known. Some had aided, others had turned their eyes away, but together they had kept the silence intact, generation after generation, until the family vanished into it. What the constables now faced was not only an unsolved case, but an entire community trained to conceal, a village bound by a pact older than law, older even than the colonizers who claimed authority over them. Every polite smile, every careful denial was part of the same defense. The investigators closed their notebooks with heavy hands. They had come searching for answers about one family. Instead, they found themselves staring into a system of secrecy that seemed to stretch back beyond memory. A net of tradition woven so tightly that to tug at one thread would unravel the whole. And the question whispered among themselves was no longer what happened to the Lees, but how many before them had met the same fate. The silence of the village was not ignorance. It was complicity. It was protection. And it was the reason the truth of the Lees would never reach the light easily. The deeper the investigators pushed, the more the land itself seemed to resist them. The village whispered. The officials retreated into silence, yet the farmhouse stood as a wound that would not close. On the third week of inquiry, one constable lingered after dusk, following a faint trail of footprints behind the Lee property. The frost had half erased them, but they led toward the edge of the fields where the ground dropped into an abandoned storage cellar, long sealed with boards. The air around the cellar was different, damp, metallic. The constable pried at the wood until nails groaned free, and a breath of stale air rose, cold and heavy, as if exhaled from the earth. When his lantern dipped into the opening, light caught the glisten of moisture on stone steps, spiraling down into a chamber that should not have been there. The walls were close, rough with hand-cut marks. Fingers had carved spirals into the damp surface, their grooves still sharp, their edges blackened by soot. The air smelled of rot and resin. He followed the steps downward, each tread bringing with it the muffled drip of unseen water. Then, as the passage widened, the floor spread into a chamber hollowed from earth and stone. Here the relics lay, fragments of pottery arranged in careful lines, shards blackened by fire, bones, small and delicate, piled in niches as though placed with ritual care. Among them were beads, ribbons, scraps of cloth, eaten by mildew, children's shoes, their straw frayed but their shapes intact, lined one wall in uneven rows. Some were so tiny they might have belonged to infants. On the far side stood a table hacked crudely from timber. Its surface bore burn marks where candles had dripped into wax mounds. The constable brushed dust from the wood and saw grooves cut into the grain, circles inside circles, forming a map of spirals like those chalked on the Lee home. Beneath the table sat a clay bowl, crusted with something dark. When he tilted it, the residue cracked and released a sour scent, coppery and foul. At the chamber's center lay the most terrible thing, a quilt. Damp, mottled with mildew, yet still recognizable as a sleeping blanket of the Lees. Stitched along the edges were patterns of small flowers in red thread, the kind a mother sews for her children. The cloth was stiff with old stains that no winter frost could disguise. It had been placed deliberately, folded neatly as if left as an offering or as proof. The constable staggered back, lantern shaking so that shadows leapt across the walls. The spirals seemed to move, curling inward toward him. He whispered a prayer and nearly dropped the light. The chamber pressed close, carrying the weight of years of hidden rites, of lives offered and sealed in silence. When he emerged, gasping into the night air, his face was drained. He reported little, scribbling only that evidence of unlawful gatherings had been found. But those who saw him knew. Something deeper had been uncovered, something that tied the Lees not to chance, not even to conspiracy, but to a tradition carved beneath the soil. And beneath that blanket, beneath that chamber, one truth loomed above all others. The Lees had been here. And something older than memory had taken them. Word spread slowly, like smoke slipping beneath doors. At first, the chamber was spoken of only among the constables, whispered in closed rooms with shutters fastened. But fragments leaked, as fragments always do, and soon villagers began to murmur that the investigators had seen the place of balance. Those who spoke carried no shock in their voices, only a strange calm, as though the truth was not new but long familiar. The first testimony came from an old priest, too frail to rise from his mat. When questioned, he smiled faintly and said, "You found the room. Then you know. It was never murder. It was covenant." His eyes clouded, but his tone held no fear. He described how the soil itself demanded payment, how the fields surrounding the village had always devoured more than seed. Blood feeds the roots. Without it, famine swallows us whole. He claimed the Lees were not taken against their will, but chosen as stewards of the pact. Their disappearance was not tragedy, but duty. An elderly midwife echoed the same doctrine. She remembered assisting at a birth in the Lee household many years earlier. After the child's cry, she said, the mother whispered a prayer not to her husband, not to the gods of the chapel, but to something older. The words were simple: "May this life be accepted when the circle returns." The midwife claimed she had heard it countless times, in countless homes, from countless mothers. It was not cruelty but tradition, an inheritance passed with each generation. The investigators gathered more evidence from ledgers hidden in the village archive. Among the records of taxes and harvest quotas lay slips of parchment written in coded shorthand. One bore the title, Balance Ledger. Instead of debts or payments, the entries listed names, each marked with a symbol beside it, a spiral, a cross, a chain. Some names were crossed out with thick black ink, others circled as if preserved for future use. One entry matched the Lees. It was marked not with a cross or a spiral, but with both. There were ritual logs as well, plain in their simplicity. Lanterns lit, songs begun, circle drawn. One log ended with the chilling phrase, "Offered with honor, harvest secured." No dates, no details, no mention of place. Only repetition, a litany of tradition carried forward in silence. The cult's structure emerged like bones rising through earth. At its center was the council, not of elders chosen for wisdom, but of families rotated to hold the secret. Each year, a different household carried the burden of arranging the rite. Midwives, teachers, even constables' kin were implicated, their roles masked as ordinary duties. The doctrine was plain: the land demanded sacrifice, and the village, to survive, gave it. To outsiders, it looked monstrous, but within the community it was described as necessity. An old farmer explained, "We do not kill, we keep balance. If the circle breaks, hunger comes. We feed the soil before it starves us." He spoke with the steady tone of one explaining weather or seasons. Murder was not in his mind, only tradition. The investigators pressed harder, asking why the Lees, why that year. Answers circled back to the same refrain: famine. Crops had withered under frost, and debt weighed heavily under colonial taxes. The Lees had been positioned. Their lineage, their silence, their isolation made them suitable. And so the choice had been made long before December. The family had been prepared. The diary, the drawings, the whispers in the courtyard, all signs that they knew that they had accepted their role. The cult was not a fringe sect. It was the village itself, its heartbeat, its secret spine. The marks on the walls, the ash circles, the chants heard drifting through fog, all were rituals practiced openly in private, concealed in plain sight. Every neighbor who claimed ignorance was a custodian of silence. Every elder who muttered about tradition was part of the chain. And still, the doctrine echoed, not murder, but balance. To investigators from outside, it was evidence of atrocity. To those within, it was the way of survival. And in that divide lay the most terrifying truth. The Lees had not been victims of cruelty, but of a system that believed their erasure was protection. The cult did not hide in caves or forests. It lived in homes, in council records, in lullabies sung to children. It was the community itself, cloaked in the language of necessity. And once revealed, it became clear that what had taken the Lees was not only ritual, but a belief as deep and unyielding as the soil itself. The investigators might have hoped that the revelation of a ritual chamber and the confessions of elders would close the case. Instead, the horror widened. For when they compared testimony with records from other provinces, a disturbing pattern emerged. Families had vanished before, quietly written off as debt runners or famine casualties. But the details repeated like an echo: bowls of food left untouched, lamps still burning, chalk spirals on wood and stone. Each disappearance was disguised as misfortune, but beneath the disguise lay the same hand. One constable, obsessed with the case, began collecting reports long after official orders told him to stop. In an abandoned police file, he uncovered a disappearance from 1921, another farming family erased overnight, their home left intact except for ash circles across the yard. A village 2 valleys away had seen the same in 1929, and in each case, the missing family's youngest child was never accounted for. The implication was unbearable. The Lees were not an isolated tragedy, but the latest chapter in a ritual that stretched across decades. The cult's ledger was not a relic. It was a living document, updated quietly in village archives, preserved under titles that seemed mundane. And still the trail did not end in the past. Testimony revealed that rituals continued even after the farmhouse burned. Lanterns were said to appear in the fields on moonless nights, weaving in slow procession toward the hills. Hunters claimed to hear chanting when frost set heavy, voices that did not belong to any living tongue. The pattern had not stopped, it had adapted. The constable who dug too deep visited an orphanage run by a local trust. He discovered its board included the same names from the balance ledger. Children who entered the orphanage often left without record, their files marked only with faint spirals in the margins. When pressed, the matron laughed softly and said, "Some debts are older than paper." Other evidence pointed to councils and land trusts that carried the silence forward. Grain allotments were adjusted in years following disappearances. Orphaned children were absorbed into households with no questions asked. Even colonial authorities seemed to look away, their reports sealed before they could be circulated. Survival, it seemed, was a shared excuse across power. Witnesses spoke of modern rituals softened to appear harmless, a torchlit procession disguised as a harvest festival, prayers whispered as folk songs, ash circles drawn in courtyards under the pretense of blessing the soil. To the untrained eye, they were remnants of superstition. To those who knew, they were continuations. And always the warnings returned. Survivors of earlier vanishings, men and women who had escaped villages under suspicion, said the same phrase, "It never ended." They described the cult not as a gathering of robed figures, but as an inheritance passed through family lines. They warned that those who asked too many questions would find themselves drawn into the spiral, first as observers, then as participants. The chilling implication was this: the Lee family was not unique, they were not the last. The silence that had erased them still lived, dressed now in more modern clothes but bound to the same belief. The circle had not been broken, it had only widened. And if the rituals had carried through famine, through war, through colonial oversight, then what hope was there that they had ceased in the present? Even as the farmhouse lay in ruins, the fields of Gyeonggi still grew heavy under frost, still demanded balance. Somewhere, under another roof, another family might already be preparing. The first crack in the wall of silence did not come from the police, nor from the council, but from a constable who had seen too much. He carried the weight of the cellar, the ledger, the whispers of children taken from orphanages, and he could no longer keep it contained. One winter night, he left his post and handed a bundle of notes to a young journalist in Seoul. Inside were sketches of spirals, fragments of the balance ledger, and testimonies that had never been allowed past the station's desk. It was not much, scraps, half-erased details, but it was enough to ignite a fire. The story appeared in print weeks later under a headline that cut like a knife: "The family that vanished in ritual, police cover, up in Gyeonggi." The article described the Lee's disappearance not as banditry, but as sacrifice. It spoke of chalk spirals, of handprints pressed into ash, of a child's diary that ended with the words, "They went smiling." Names appeared too: council elders, midwives, and trustees linked to the orphanage. Though the journalist lacked full proof, he had just enough to seed outrage. The reactions spread like frost across the land. In Seoul, readers debated whether it was superstition dressed as fact or fact dressed as superstition. Rural papers repeated the story with their own embellishments, turning it into something between scandal and folklore. But in Gyeonggi itself, where the farmhouse once stood, the effect was devastating. Younger villagers raged that their elders had hidden blood under the word tradition. They demanded trials, answers, anything to sever themselves from the spiral. The older generation clung to silence, insisting the journalist had twisted harmless rites into horror. At markets, voices rose into shouting matches. In one chapel, a service collapsed into brawls when a parishioner accused his neighbor's family of being keepers of the debt. Colonial authorities, caught off guard, scrambled to contain the fire. They issued statements dismissing the report as hysteria, the invention of folk minds weakened by famine. Yet behind closed doors, police archives were stripped bare. Files on the Lees and other vanished families were collected, stamped, classified, and locked away in drawers no one could reach. Orders were sent to silence constables who had spoken too freely. Some were reassigned far from Gyeonggi, others resigned rather than carry the weight of complicity. But the spiral was no longer hidden. Other whistleblowers stepped forward, a former schoolteacher who admitted seeing children scrawl symbols on their slates, a midwife who recalled being paid too generously after a birth, a farmer who confessed to witnessing a torchlit procession vanishing into the hills. Their voices were fragmented, sometimes contradictory, yet together they sketched the outline of something undeniable. Then came the photographs. A reporter smuggled into the village captured the burned remains of the Lee farmhouse, the soil still dark in places where ash circles had once been. Another photograph, grainy but chilling, showed the ledger itself, open on a table, names marked with spirals and crosses. When these images reached print, denial faltered. Silence had to harden into something else. The fallout was swift and uneven. A handful of local leaders named in the reports were arrested. Others fled before authorities could reach them. Some, cornered by exposure, ended their lives quietly, leaving notes that echoed the same refrain: "The debt is paid, the circle turns." To their families, these suicides were explained as shame. To outsiders, they were proof. In the village, daily life unraveled, trust dissolved. Families who had lived side by side for generations now eyed one another with suspicion. Children whispered about their parents' names appearing in the newspapers. Shops closed early. At night, entire streets lay dark, the houses shuttered as though waiting for something to pass. And yet, even as fragments of truth surfaced, the full story remained sealed. Every new testimony was countered by official denials. Every leaked page was followed by confiscations. Journalists were threatened, their presses raided. By the time the storm began to ebb, much of the evidence had vanished back into locked cabinets. The exposure was partial, jagged, enough to leave scars, not enough to heal them. The name of the Lees spread across headlines, but their fate remained unsolved. The cult was named, but never dismantled. The spiral was glimpsed, then hidden again. When the dust settled, the village was left in a strange twilight, not free of suspicion, not fully condemned. The world now knew that something had happened, but not what. The silence that had protected the spiral had cracked, yet it had not broken. The Lee disappearance, once a local wound, had become something larger, a symbol of how easily horror hides beneath the fabric of daily life, and how, even when exposed, it slips back into shadow. The journalists left, the papers turned to news scandals, the colonial officers sealed their files. But in the village, people still remembered. The farmhouse might have burned, the fields might have grown over, but the spirals endured, not in chalk or ash, but in memory. And memory, whispered across generations, was enough to keep the circle alive. The story of the Lee family should end with facts. Names written in ledgers, chalk spirals traced across beams, photographs smuggled into papers, headlines that burned for a week before being buried in sealed drawers. But it does not end there. It ends in silence. A silence that has stretched nearly a century, heavy and unbroken, carrying questions that no archive can answer. What does it mean for a family to vanish without trace, leaving behind warm bowls of rice and quilts pressed with the shapes of sleeping children? What does it mean for neighbors to whisper of chanting in the hills, of lanterns weaving into the night, yet lower their eyes when asked to testify? It means that the ordinary can warp without warning. That horror does not always come dressed as a monster. Sometimes it wears the face of duty, of custom, of balance kept at any cost. The Lee farmhouse is gone. Fire took it years after the family disappeared, leaving only scorched soil where the courtyard once held a circle of ash. The walls that bore spirals have crumbled to dust. And yet the questions remain. Were the Lees victims or participants? Did they resist, or did they bow to a covenant older than memory? And what of the youngest child, the one body never found? Was she taken into the spiral, or did she escape it? There are no graves to visit, no markers to lay flowers against. The family exists now only in fragments, a diary entry scrawled by a village boy. They went smiling, a quilt found folded among bones, a ledger marked with spirals and crosses. Pieces that refuse to join into one clear picture. Pieces that leave more dread than clarity. Perhaps the most chilling truth is not what happened, but how it was kept. Silence protected the spiral better than walls or chains ever could. Neighbors denied, councils concealed, officials sealed their files, and in that silence the pattern endured. Survivors warned, again and again. It never ended. So the story does not close, it lingers, unfinished, its weight pressing forward into the present. If famine and war and colonial rule could not break the circle, then who is to say it has been broken now? Even as the farmhouse rotted into earth, the fields around Gyeonggi still demanded their balance. Even now, another family could be preparing, quietly, obediently, smiling as they vanish. That is the terror left to us. Not only that the Lees were erased, but that their erasure was accepted, folded into the rhythm of life, remembered not as crime but as necessity. Evil hidden in the guise of tradition, disguised as protection. We tell their story now because history will not tell it for us. We speak their names because silence has already spoken long enough. And yet, as the spiral teaches, every ending turns back into a beginning. The Lee family is gone, but the spiral waits. Dark stories never end where we expect them to. The Lees taught us that. A family erased in silence, their lives folded into ritual, their absence explained away until only whispers remained. And yet, even as their farmhouse burned to ash, the spiral carried forward, reminding us that such vanishings are not bound by one place or one time. Because just 6 years later, on the other side of Asia, another family disappeared. This time, it was not Korea under colonial rule, but Japan in its final year of war. The world was already drowning in fire and famine, yet even against that backdrop of chaos, the Himuro disappearance was different. It was not bombs or hunger that erased them. It was something older, something bound to ritual. The Lee farmhouse left behind chalk spirals and ash circles. The Himuro home, outside Tokyo, offered its own symbols. Ropes tied to beams, stains on the floor, mirrors scrawled with desperate kanji. Where Korea's tragedy was buried under the excuse of famine, Japan's was buried under the excuse of war. Both carried the same weight. A family gone without farewell, a house left waiting as if life had paused mid-breath. And so the question echoes again, were they victims of violence or of something far darker? Did they flee in shame, or were they claimed by the very rituals meant to protect them? The answers may be lost to history, but the patterns remain. A farmhouse sealed, a family erased, whispers of curses, of rituals failed, of debts paid not in coin but in blood. This is the story of the Himuro family, Japan's darkest disappearance, a spiral carved into frozen soil and a silence that still lingers. Snow fell thick across the outskirts of Tokyo in the winter of 1944, muffling every sound until the countryside seemed drowned in silence. It was the final year of the war, and though the city smoldered under raids and shortages, life in the villages on its edge clung stubbornly to routine. Farmers still rose before dawn to tend their fields. Mothers still boiled rice in iron pots. Children still carried bundles of wood across roads dusted with frost. To look upon it, one might have believed the world outside had not collapsed. But even in that stillness, something felt wrong. At the end of a narrow path, beneath the bare skeletons of persimmon trees, stood the Himuro farmhouse. Modest, weathered, its walls darkened by decades of smoke. The Himuro family had lived there for generations, respected as guardians of old traditions, keepers of rituals most no longer dared to speak aloud. To neighbors, they seemed ordinary enough, a father, a mother, children who bowed politely at gatherings, yet behind their closed doors lingered a history whispered about but never questioned. One morning in December, the farmhouse lay strangely open, its sliding doors gaped into the cold, rattling faintly as the wind pressed through. Smoke no longer curled from its chimney. The courtyard was dusted with snow but bore no footprints, no signs of movement. Inside, the hearth still held a pot of rice, steam frozen mid-rise, as though abandoned in the middle of a meal. Futons were laid neatly across the floor, indentations showing where bodies had lain only hours before, and yet no voices answered when names were called. No children stirred. No adults emerged to greet their neighbors. The silence was heavier than the snow itself, and with it came a growing dread. For the Himuro family, father, mother, children had vanished. Not fled, not buried in rubble, not claimed by war. They had been erased within the walls of their own home, leaving behind nothing but the marks of something no one wished to name. And in that frozen stillness, one question lingered in every mind that dared to cross the threshold. What force could make an entire family disappear, and why did it leave their house waiting, as if they had only just stepped out into the snow? At first, it was the small things that unsettled the neighbors. A delivery boy noticed the gate left ajar, its wooden bar dangling loose, though the Himuro father was known for keeping it tightly secured. A chicken wandered in the yard, wings dusted with snow, pecking at the frozen soil where no grain had been scattered. Then came the absence of smoke. In winter, there was always smoke, curling from chimneys before dawn, but that morning the air above the farmhouse was empty, pale against the sky. By mid-morning, a neighbor carrying kindlings stopped outside the open door. She called softly, expecting the familiar answer of the Himuro mother, but only the wind replied. With unease tightening her chest, she stepped inside. The house greeted her not with warmth, but with a strange order, as if everything had been paused. The hearth still held a pot of rice, steam clinging faintly above its rim, though no one had lifted a bowl. Futons were laid neatly across the floor, their indentations shaped by bodies that had not risen to greet the day. Wooden sandals were paired carefully at the edge of the mats. A half-folded robe lay draped over a screen, its sleeves hanging like waiting arms. Yet no voices stirred, no footsteps creaked the boards. Only the cold settled deeper into the house. It was then that she saw the first of the ropes. Thin cords, tied to the beams above, dangled loosely, their ends frayed as if they had been pulled and then abandoned. More cords hung in the adjoining room, each knotted carefully, as though placed with intent. Beneath them, dark stains mottled the floorboards. They were not splashes of spilled tea or oil. They were thicker, irregular, seeping into the grain of the wood in patterns that suggested something heavier had fallen there. The neighbors gathered quickly, whispering in sharp tones. None wished to cross fully into the rooms, yet all peered at what had been left behind. Mirrors stood propped against the walls, their glass marked with crude kanji, written in what looked like smeared ink. The words were half-formed, frantic, as though scrawled in haste. In the garden, just beyond the sliding doors, snow concealed a carving in the soil, a spiral gouged into the earth, its edges frozen hard. When the police were summoned, they moved through the house with practiced detachment. They noted the ropes, the stains, the mirrors, and the spiral, but they offered no explanations. They wrote their reports with clipped hands, as if hurrying to finish. Outside, the war thundered toward its final year, and the disappearance of one family was a small matter compared to the collapse of the nation. Yet, to the villagers, the scene was unforgettable. Life had not been broken inside the Himuro house. It had been paused, interrupted by something older than war, older than reason. The neighbors whispered of curses, of rituals left unfinished, of debts that no one dared name aloud. And always, the same question hung unspoken in the cold air. What force could sweep an entire family away, leaving their world behind intact, but marked, unmistakably, by ritual? Among the belongings left scattered through the Himuro farmhouse, the investigators found fragments that unsettled them more than the ropes or the stains. Tucked beneath a futon was a narrow notebook, its paper browned at the edges, its brushstrokes uneven. The early pages spoke of ordinary things, planting schedules, debts, family meals. But as the entries reached the final months of 1944, the tone changed. The handwriting grew erratic, the words darker. One passage read, "The maiden grows restless. She does not bow as she should. The voices in the beams grow louder each night. They say the binding will fail." Another entry, "If the rope ceremony falters, we all will be taken. The mirrors are prepared. They will hold back the shadow if the circle breaks." The final page ended abruptly, a single word repeated 3 times before the ink smeared. "Forgive, forgive, forgive." Beneath the notebook were drawings, charcoal sketches, pressed into rice paper by a child's hand. They showed the farmhouse interior, ropes stretching from the beams like spider threads, figures standing in a circle beneath them. One drawing was stranger still, A girl drawn with blank eyes, ropes tied to her wrists, her mouth open as if screaming, though no sound could pass. Other evidence surfaced in the adjoining rooms. Slips of parchment folded into bundles, hidden within a rice jar, carried fragments of prayers. The sacrifice binds the gate. The maiden must not resist. If she turns her eyes away, all will suffer. On one, written in trembling strokes, were the words, "The blood must be willing." Neighbors, pressed by police, added their own uneasy recollections. Some admitted they had seen lanterns burning at the Himuro house far past midnight. Others claimed to hear the sound of chanting, low, rhythmic, unlike Buddhist prayer. A young boy confessed that he once peeked through the window and saw the Himuro daughter standing in the center of the room, ropes tied loosely to her wrists, her family circling her in silence. He fled before he could see more. What disturbed the investigators most was the way the fragments aligned. The diary, the drawings, the prayers, the witnesses. Each spoke of an ancient rite, a rope ritual meant to bind a great evil. But they also spoke of failure, of a chosen maiden who would not submit, of a family unraveling under a weight they could no longer carry. And so the case hardened around its central mystery. The Himuro family had not been erased by war, nor by bandits, nor by chance. They had been swallowed by a ritual, one that left behind its marks like shadows burned into the walls. Yet the deeper question remained, whispered even among the police as they closed their notebooks. Had the family been destroyed by their own hands, or by something far older, something their ritual had failed to contain? The police might have expected clarity once the farmhouse was catalogued, but the further they pressed into the village, the more the lines blurred. Every question met with averted eyes. Every testimony felt rehearsed, smoothed of detail, as if the entire community had agreed upon the same silence. Neighbors who had known the Himuros for decades insisted they were ordinary, a hard-working family, nothing more. Yet when pressed, small fractures appeared. An old reverend admitted in whispers that the family had long avoided chapel services. Instead, he had once glimpsed their courtyard lit by lanterns, figures bowing in unison, ropes glinting in the firelight. When he asked later, the Himuro mother bowed politely, but said only, "We guard what others have forgotten." The schoolteacher confessed his unease as well. The Himuro children, once diligent, had begun drawing strange symbols on their slates. Circles, spirals, kanji twisted into shapes he could not read. When he scolded them, they laughed softly and whispered, "It keeps the shadows out." He had erased the marks quickly, but the memory lingered, etched deeper than chalk could ever cut. Others spoke with more reluctance. A midwife, old and nearly blind, recalled being called to the Himuro house years earlier. After delivering a child, she noticed ropes hidden beneath the futon, their fibers darkened with old stains. She was paid generously, too generously, and told never to speak of what she had seen. Her voice broke as she murmured, "They were bound, as we all are." When investigators turned to council records, the evasions deepened. Slips of paper tucked between harvest reports referred to provisions for binding and ensuring continuity in lean years. One note, unsigned, read simply, "If the maiden resists, the debt will fall to all." The more the officers pressed, the clearer it became that this was not the secret of a single household. It was a pact held in place by the village itself, a covenant no one dared to name. Some elders grew sharp, warning the police to leave the matter alone. Others fell silent, gazes fixed on the ground as if in shame or fear. And still the fragments aligned. The ropes, the stains, the mirrors scrawled with frantic kanji, the spiral carved into frozen soil. They were not the remnants of a random tragedy. They were the traces of a ritual the village had allowed, perhaps even demanded, until the family disappeared into it. The police closed their notebooks with uneasy hands. They had come to solve a disappearance. Instead, they had uncovered a conspiracy bound not by criminals, but by tradition, a silence guarded as fiercely as any secret. The question that now loomed was no longer what happened to the Himuro family, but how many before them had been consumed by the same ritual, erased with the same silence. The deeper the investigators looked, the more the house itself seemed determined to betray its secrets. On the third evening, one officer lingered after the others had gone. Lantern in hand, he walked the edges of the garden, tracing the faint grooves of the spiral carved into frozen soil. His boot struck something hollow beneath the snow, a plank of wood, half buried, nailed across a trapdoor. The nails were old, rusted, but the boards had been hammered with force, as if someone had wanted to keep something sealed. He pried them loose. A draught rose up, damp and bitter, carrying the smell of mildew and something coppery, metallic, that clung to the throat. The lantern's glow caught narrow steps spiraling downward into darkness. The walls were rough earth, carved by hand, and each surface bore grooves, spirals etched deep with fingertips, charred at their edges by soot. As the officer descended, he heard water dripping in the black, each drop echoing like a heartbeat. The steps opened into a low chamber, hollowed from the ground itself. There, relics lay scattered. Clay bowls blackened by fire, candles melted into pools of wax, ropes knotted and discarded in corners. Against one wall, bones were stacked neatly, too small, too fragile, as though belonging to animals or perhaps children. Beside them sat shards of mirrors, their surfaces cracked, their backs painted with streaks of ink like desperate kanji prayers. At the chamber's center stood a crude wooden post. Its base was stained dark, the wood splintered where ropes had once bitten deep. Around it lay fragments of fabric, a sleeve torn from a kimono, a child's sandal, its strap snapped. The officer's lantern shook in his grip. But the most terrible find was at the far edge of the chamber, a futon, folded carefully, embroidered with the Himuro crest. The cloth was stiff, with stains that time had not erased. It had been placed deliberately, like an offering or a reminder. The chamber pressed in with silence, thick and suffocating. The spirals carved in its walls seemed to turn in the shifting light, drawing the officer deeper, though he dared not move. He whispered a prayer, clutching the lantern, and staggered back up the stairs. When he emerged into the snow, his face was ashen. He reported nothing of what he had seen. His official note would later read only, "Evidence of unlawful gatherings beneath the property." But those who met his eyes afterward knew he had looked upon something that words could not contain. The house had not merely sheltered a family. It had been a vessel, a stage for rites buried in soil and silence. And the futon folded in the earth told the truth none dared to say. The Himuros had not left their home. They had been bound to it, body, blood, and silence, until nothing of them remained. Word of the underground chamber spread, but what disturbed investigators most was how calmly the elders received the news. They did not gasp. They did not deny. They only nodded, as if something long hidden had been found sooner than expected. An aging priest was the first to speak. When questioned, he did not hesitate. "It was never murder," he said, voice thin but steady. "It was duty. The rope binds what prayers cannot." He told them the Himuro family had guarded an ancient rite for generations, a rope ritual meant to seal away a great shadow. Every few decades, a maiden was chosen. Her body became the cord, her blood the knot. If she resisted, the binding failed, and the family bore the weight together. The midwife, half-blind and trembling, gave her confession in fragments. She remembered births in the Himuro home where mothers whispered not thanks but promises to return the life they had borrowed when the circle came again. She remembered seeing ropes hung above the infant's cradle, their fibers marked with red. They all knew, she said. It was inheritance, To be born Himuro was to serve the rope. Documents deepened the dread. Among ration lists and wartime notices, investigators found ledgers that did not track grain or taxes, but names. Beside each was a symbol, a spiral, a knot, a kanji for debt. Some names had been crossed out, others circled. The last entries bore the Himuro crest. There were logs too, written in cold simplicity: ropes prepared, mirrors aligned, maiden bound, ritual begun. The final line ended differently: ritual broken, all claimed. The doctrine became clear. To the villagers, sacrifice was not seen as death but as balance, a transaction between flesh and spirit. The Himuros were not victims in their eyes, but guardians fulfilling a covenant. Their disappearance was not tragedy, but tradition. For the investigators, that was the most chilling truth of all. The cult was not a hidden sect. It was the family itself, and, by silence, the village around them. Every rope tied to a beam, every kanji smeared across mirrors, every spiral carved into soil was not an accident. It was belief, and in that belief, the Himuro family had been erased, not by war, not by chance, but by the very ritual they had been born to uphold. The investigators might have hoped the Himuro chamber was the final chapter, but as they pieced together the ledgers, the prayers, and the testimonies, they began to see echoes stretching far beyond one farmhouse. Files hidden in dusty drawers told of earlier vanishings in neighboring prefectures, always dismissed as famine, runaway debt, or wartime chaos. Yet the details repeated like a refrain: meals abandoned mid-bite, futons pressed with the shapes of sleepers, ropes hanging from beams, spirals gouged into soil. One constable, obsessed, traced disappearances back decades. In 1922, a family in Niigata left their hearth burning, their house empty, ropes dangling from rafters. In 1931, another family outside Nagano vanished in the same silence, their mirrors smeared with kanji too frantic to decipher. In every case, the youngest daughter was unaccounted for. It was a pattern too precise to dismiss. The implication was unbearable. The Himuros were not an isolated tragedy, but one turn in a wheel that kept spinning, generation after generation. The rope ritual was not myth, not relic, but a practice that adapted, shifting forms to survive war and modern scrutiny. Testimonies gathered after the farmhouse burned spoke of torches seen weaving into the hills on moonless nights, of low chanting carried by the wind, of spirals carved fresh into the ground even as American bombs fell over Tokyo. Hunters swore they stumbled upon clearings where ropes still hung from trees, frayed and darkened by age. A farmer admitted that in the leanest years he saw neighbors bury mirrors beneath their thresholds, muttering prayers not to gods, but to shadows. The trail even led into post-war institutions, an orphanage outside Tokyo, run by a trust tied to Himuro relatives, held incomplete records. Children entered, but never left, their files marked with crude spiral doodles in the margins. When pressed, the matron smiled faintly and said, "Some bindings must continue. Paper cannot hold them." Survivors who fled villages spoke with sharper warnings. One woman whispered that she had been prepared for the ritual herself, a rope maiden, but escaped before the night came. "It never ended," she insisted. "The rope still waits. If one fails, another is chosen." What chilled the investigators most was not only that the rituals had continued, but that they had disguised themselves. Festivals with lanterns, songs passed off as lullabies, spirals drawn in gardens as blessings. To outsiders, they looked like remnants of harmless superstition. To those who knew, they were continuations, the rope ritual surviving in plain sight. The Himuro family may have been consumed in 1944, but the spiral carved in their garden was not the last. The silence around their disappearance was not the silence of death, but of continuation. And so the question sharpened. If the rope ritual had endured through famine, through war, through occupation, what hope was there that it had ended now? Even as their farmhouse crumbled to earth, somewhere in Japan another family might already be preparing the ropes. The silence that had shrouded the Himuro case could not last forever. It cracked first, not in the village, but in the press. A former constable, burdened by what he had seen in the chamber, passed fragments of evidence to a wartime journalist after the surrender. In his hands were sketches of ropes tied to beams, photographs of mirrors smeared with frantic kanji, and a torn ledger page marked with the Himuro crest. The article that followed struck like lightning. Family vanishes in ritual, the Himuro mystery. The media storm was immediate. Newspapers across Japan seized the story, hungry for something other than ruin and rationing. The Himuro tragedy was painted as everything from a wartime cover-up to proof of ancient curses. Some reporters framed it as folklore to sell papers, while others insisted it was fact, bolstered by the constable's testimony and the surviving documents. In the village itself, the reaction was devastating. Younger residents erupted in anger, accusing elders of sacrificing silence to hide blood. How many families before? They demanded in crowded meetings. The elders responded with tight mouths and downcast eyes. Some muttered that the journalist had twisted superstition into scandal. Others wept openly, claiming the exposure had broken a covenant meant to protect them all. Authorities scrambled to contain the uproar. Police statements dismissed the reports as hysteria, while military censors quietly collected copies of the incriminating article. Files were seized, boxed, and stamped classified. Several officers who had investigated too deeply were reassigned, their careers cut short. Still, more fragments leaked, photographs of the burned farmhouse, sketches of the underground chamber, and testimony from neighbors who admitted hearing chants that were not prayers. The fallout was uneven and brutal. A handful of village leaders, named in whispers as guardians of the ritual, were arrested briefly before being quietly released. Others fled before warrants could be served. A few ended their own lives, leaving notes that spoke not of guilt, but of debts repaid and the rope fulfilled. Their deaths were explained as wartime despair, but villagers knew better. Daily life fractured. Families who had lived side by side for centuries now regarded each other with suspicion. Children whispered about whose names might be in the ledgers. Shops closed early. Nights were darker, lanterns left unlit, as if everyone feared what the shadows might reveal. And yet, just as quickly as the scandal ignited, it was smothered. Officials silenced reporters, seized evidence, sealed archives. By the time the storm ebbed, the truth had been dragged into light only long enough to terrify, never long enough to settle. The Himuro disappearance was never solved. The ropes were never explained. The spiral carved in frozen earth was never erased. What emerged from the exposure was only fragments, enough to mark the family as a symbol of horror, not enough to destroy the silence that had swallowed them. The rope ritual had been named, but naming it did not end it. It only left a scar, a reminder that some truths, once spoken, sink deeper into shadow rather than disappear. The story of the Himuro family ends not with clarity, but with a silence that still unsettles. Their farmhouse has long since collapsed, the beams rotted, the soil grown over. The ropes that once dangled from rafters have turned to dust, and the mirrors smeared with frantic kanji lie buried somewhere beneath the earth. And yet, the questions remain, sharp as the winter air of that final December. What does it mean for a family to vanish in the heart of war, when death was already everywhere, yet to leave behind something stranger than battle could explain? What does it mean that their hearth still steamed with rice, their futons pressed with the shapes of bodies, their gardens scarred with a spiral? The war gave many excuses: bombings, famine, dislocation, but none fit the scene left inside the Himuro home. Were they victims of their own ritual, destroyed by a covenant they had failed to fulfill? Or were they taken by the very thing they had been sworn to bind? Some testimonies claimed the rope maiden resisted, that the ritual broke, and the family turned upon itself in frenzy. Others whispered that when the ropes snapped, shadows poured in, swallowing them all. There are no graves, no bones to mourn, no official record to consult. Only fragments, a diary repeating, "Forgive, forgive, forgive," a futon folded in an underground chamber, ledgers marked with spirals, neighbors recalling chants that were not prayers, pieces that fit together only enough to remind us how little we know. Perhaps the most chilling truth is not their disappearance, but the way silence guarded it. Authorities sealed files. Elders spoke of duty, not death. And time, like earth over a grave, buried the rest. The Himuro tragedy leaves us with no resolution, only dread. If a family could vanish so completely, consumed not by war but by ritual, then what assurance do we have that the rope ritual has truly ended? Perhaps somewhere another family prepares. Perhaps even now, another spiral waits in the soil. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you like them and want to listen to more, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.